Welcome, everyone. We're ready to start now. We'll just be starting in a minute.
I think it's time for us to start. So we'll start the session for today. Very warm welcome everyone to Education South Asia seminar. As many of you might already know, since last July last year, we have been running this series of seminar on the theme of education and South Asia, and we have been taking these conversations forward through this Education South Asia network, which is a collaborative platform for discussions around various issues regarding education and South Asia. So please do sign up for our mailing list and we'll keep you updated on our activities. And for today's session, we are very delighted to have Dr. Matluba Khan for the final Education South Asia seminar for this year. Dr. Khan is a lecturer in urban design at School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. And prior to joining Cardiff University, Dr. Khan worked as a research fellow at University College London and served as assistant professor in Department of Architecture at Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. And Dr. Khan's research lies in environmental behavior studies, particularly the relationship between design of children's environments and their learning and well-being. And Dr. Khan is also recipient of multiple international accolades for design and research of learning environment that includes EDRA Great Spaces Award 2016 and ASLA Honors Award 2017. And she's currently involved in multiple international research projects in Bangladesh, UK, and Brazil around planning and design of child-friendly environments in schools and communities. So very, very warm welcome, Dr. Khan, to Education South Asia seminar. And we'd like to now invite you to present for about 25 minutes, and we'll take the questions from the audience after your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Uma. Thanks very much for the generous introduction and also inviting me to present on this topic of the role of place in teaching and learning. A very warm welcome to all the audience who have taken the time to come to this session. I think I'll start by sharing my screen. Yeah. Does it look all right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So today, I was almost thinking of just putting together my 14 years of research in teaching and learning environments, and in kind of 25 minutes, which is of course a difficult job, but what I'll try to do is give perhaps I'll keep a focus on my PhD research, but we'll also briefly share my kind of journey to this. Okay, so generally, I'd say because it's Education South Asia, I'm focusing on the kind of more kind of teaching and learning environments or physical environment for teaching and learning in South Asian context, where perhaps most primary schools would look like something like this, where kind of, if we think of a more a teaching and learning environment, what we find is the key elements there are, of course, the teacher, the student, the text, the curricular content, the textbook, and in most cases, we think that this is what is needed to have an effective teaching and learning environment. And what we perhaps in most cases forget is this place within which teacher, student, and all other aspects are coming together. So the aspect of environment or place to a certain extent remains invisible. Research in education in the past decades predominantly focused on teachers' skills and capacities, individual factors and kind of students' demographies, and also development of the content and curricula. And as I said, the place where teaching and learning activities are taking place almost remained invisible, or to a certain extent went out of fashion. And this is perhaps true for both the classroom environment and also the outdoor environment. Sorry, something just is happening. The slides are not moving, sorry. So the design of the classroom, be it indoors or outdoors, and generally creation of appropriate physical or natural environment, is seldom researched, more specifically in the context of Global South. So when you're saying, does place actually have a role? So does place have a role in teaching and learning? And for this, perhaps you need to get back to the kind of very that equation by Carl Lewin, where who states that individual behavior is a function of the person, including their history, personality, and motivation, and their environment. And this environment includes both physical and social surroundings. But lately, the social surroundings have taken the precedence, and the physical aspects of environment have not been considered. Again, I kind of turn to Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, where Bronfenbrenner divided the person's environment into 5 different systems: microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, and the chronosystem. The microsystems is perhaps the most influential level of the ecological systems theory. And this is the most immediate environmental surroundings. And we can see there is always an emphasis on the social environment of a child, but then these social aspects are shaped by the space a child grows up in. So bringing this all into the kind of and school is one of the places where a child spends most of their times, and that perhaps to a certain extent is that the research of school space actually demands attention just from that very basic fact that this is the space that holds a child for majority of their waking hours. But so if we are to look into how we want to design space for pedagogy, we of course need to learn how a child learns, or how do we learn. And of course, I go back to kind of the classical theories of Piaget's theory and Vygotsky's theory of constructivism and social constructivism to understand that a child interacts, creates their knowledge through, or constructs their knowledge of the world by acting upon objects in space and time, and they learn through interaction with their surrounding environment, the physical, and as well as the interaction with other with peers. So the physical environment that we will be designing is something that should foster this exploration of the elements within the physical space, but also the interactions between peers and with teachers and children. And from this, and also drawing on kind of theories of behavior settings and concept of affordance, the framework that I kind of depend on, or base my research on is that if environment is designed as a combination of different behavior settings that can offer opportunities for cognitive, social, emotional, and physical. So they offer these affordances for formal and informal learning space, learning processes that happen within a space. And as to certain extent, so what kind of spaces then help foster this development of child, the physical development, cognitive development, or socio-emotional development? This is a very draft sketch in terms of what I have come to through kind of observation of around 50 primary schools across Bangladesh when I was doing my undergraduate final year dissertation on rethinking children's learning environment. And what I have, and through observation of the schools and how learning is happening and what kind of spaces are offering these scopes for development, I have come to 10 distinct typologies for places. So this just shows a snapshot, but so there are kind of detailed discussion on how these different spaces could be designed and how that affect teaching and learning activities. So so this typology of space includes we need to design interactive space, passive space, personalized space, spaces for exploration and experimentation, active space, spaces for large and small group activities, spaces with a connection, having connection with nature, spaces for play, and we need to create region stimulating environment where we at the same time we need to think building school buildings or its environment as an image of the cultural and tradition. So the design of the physical environment should be embedded within a particular context and cultural settings. However, if we think of how the schooling system or formal schooling system has evolved, that takes us to 1950s and 60s when the formal schooling system or more kind of how the design of schools has been to a certain extent parachuted in the global south or in the colonies from more Western concepts. So how the Western concepts of formal schooling has been transported to the to then colonies, the post-war a design or like post-war conceptions of how spaces should be designed. So which and that to a certain extent created the how the modern more kind of schooling schools in the global south are mostly what has been at that point parachuted from the west to the to, if you say, east or emerging countries. So and all this happened in kind of after the establishment of the United Nations, and that UNESCO worked with the mission of setting up school design standards and building schools in those countries. So as I said, so therefore the international standards of the school design mainly what it remained from what we have learned in 1950s and 60s in the West. And although following that, in 1970s and 80s, emphasis, as I said, emphasis was given what is being taught and how it's being taught, and funding also being sanctioned for kind of training of teachers and learning materials. However, kind of despite the pedagogical processes, the changes in pedagogical process and also development of and also in a way the model of education being challenged by the education theorists and psychologists such as like John Dewey and Maria Montessori. It has led to a kind of student-focused or child-centered learning, which had an effect on the kind of design of classroom or school architecture for early years learning in the developed world. And we can see some of these kind of models being implemented in the emerging world. Or so yeah, I have always I have yet not come into terms into what to say, the kind of the global South versus developing countries versus emerging world. But however, we kind of the terminology we use, the architecture for early years learning, so we have been kind of developed in more kind of private settings in those countries. So if I speak about in terms of Bangladeshi context, the majority, the public schools that provide education for majority children are still in the same model of what we have seen, but the private schools have seen changes in the design and development of spaces. And still now, I think the model, although the theories and pedagogy have kind of developed and challenged, critiqued, evolved, still the kind of the discussion around school buildings and school architecture remain there. So perhaps I have gone a bit long on the kind of why, where we have been so far, and how actually it also has affected the kind of teaching and learning in the global South. That still, actually, we think that it we do not we think of kind of equipping teachers with the skills rather than along with kind of equipping them with the resources, such as a conducive learning environment or physical environment to impart the learning. And that leads to my research in my PhD, where I endeavored to kind of look into the relationship between physical environment and children's learning, to a certain extent explored the research question that to what extent the change in learning environments actually can have an effect on children's learning outcomes. And that's where this this drawing is something that that I like very much, that shows like how the change to a certain extent in the environment. I think it doesn't need to a certain extent be researched to say that learning that is happening in the second image is much more experiential, and a child will learn that will remember that their whole life, I think. So, and as I said, so that's what kind of also to a certain extent inspired me to look into outdoor learning environments. So traditionally, school buildings are in the discussion, and outdoor learning environments, although kind of have been researched a lot, the aspect of design of outdoor learning environments again remain under-researched. Where the outdoor environment is actually isn't considered as an independent variable that can shape teaching and learning. So what I did in my PhD research is adopted a kind of mixed methods quasi-experimental research strategy to investigate how the change in outdoor environments of a school can actually, as I said, just can impact children's attainment, their motivation to learn, and therefore kind of improve the kind of quality of education. So as part of that, a kind of co-designed and developed a school ground in a Bangladeshi primary school with children and young people and the community, and evaluated the impact of kind of design of use of that environment for science and maths teaching, like how it had affected children's academic attainment. So just to show, like, as part of the co-design process, we used different methods to explore what children wanted in their school grounds, not only for play, but for teaching and learning as well. So we often underestimate what children can share in terms of their vision for an effective teaching and learning environment. We also did kind of brainstorming sessions with teachers, where teachers shared with us what they would need to effectively teach science and maths and other subjects in the outdoor environment. And we also discussed with parents and teachers. And we have developed the school ground as a combination of different behavior settings. As that this is the school ground before intervention. So it was basically a barren a playground where children could mostly play as football, and girls didn't have really, or were kind of playing at the edge of around the edge of the school ground, and hasn't been used for teaching and learning. So what we did is, working together, we designed it as a combination of different behavior settings. So I can come to in detail share a bit more detail on the kind of different settings. And so this was the school ground before intervention, and this is after intervention. As you can see, like, just this image shows perhaps several areas, a water area, and a setting for a small group of activities or passive space. There's a play area and an outdoor classroom, and this mural is drawn by children themselves. So perhaps so then I mapped children's activities within the school ground before and after intervention. So children's activities during their classroom activities, but also during their break. So just perhaps it's interesting to see how learning could happen in a classroom. As you say, this is kind of a different time span. So it's like 10 minutes into it, 5 minutes into a teaching, into a classroom activities. This is like 20 minutes into a classroom activities, and this is 35 minutes into a classroom activities. And in the classroom, as you can see, the dots are children. And perhaps this will show as that the school ground actually offered them a much wider space and more richer elements to work with. And what was saying previously, that offered much more opportunities for interaction with teachers and peers and exploration of the environment. Some more kind of examples, perhaps what was happening in these different behavior settings. And so we there is a control school where no change happened. So there are 3 groups. One with access to outdoor spaces, who had access to outdoor spaces for my maths and science class from January to May. Most maths and science classes happened outdoors, and then one group within the school who did have access to the school grounds for play, but not for their classes, and then another group, control school, where no changes in the school grounds happened, so they did have the access. The kind of results showed that the children who had access to the school grounds had significantly improved in maths and science compared to the control school, but also to comparison group. But another interesting aspect was that the comparison group who had whose performance also improved, although not significantly, but from kind of baseline, just because of their access to the school ground. So the opportunities for exploration have increased significantly following the intervention, although there was no significant change in children's peer interaction within the school ground, and this this was perhaps because in this area children do know each other and their neighbors, and were also interacting a lot outside the school hours. And there is positive change in teachers' agency too, like whereas teaching in the classroom was to some teachers boring, and for them it was more fun to teach in the outdoor learning environment, weather permitting, and the outdoor environment actually offered them the opportunity to be creative in their teaching and learning process. So this is something was quite interesting to me, because when I started this research project, the focus was only on the kind of attainment of children rather than teachers. And so the effect on teachers actually was a finding that I have not expected, but something that has a lot of kind of meaning and just implications for kind of design of learning environments. So just sharing the kind of methodologies of how to kind of co-design and develop school grounds as captured in this book, Place, Pedagogy and Play, but also the book includes co-edited volume includes contributions from researchers across the world on different aspects of place, pedagogy, and play, how then these three concepts can be brought together. Just developing on this project is our recent project in Bangladesh, where we try to explore like how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the kind of how teachers, children, and parents negotiated spaces in the school ground, at home, and in the neighborhood for teaching and learning. So COVID-19 pandemic has kind of shared with us that kind of have taught us a great deal of things, and particularly the thing that the inequalities have accentuated, and that it is something kind of particularly in the kind of spatial inequalities when learning has extended beyond the school building to actually home. So where children where children who have access to digital tools and who have access to space, a dedicated room or dedicated space within their home environment, could still continue teaching and learning, who attended, that's the kind of physical aspect part, and there are also kind of social and economic aspects to it. But then children who didn't have dedicated space, who didn't have access to the digital space, have kind of fallen so there was this learning gap that's been created because of the pandemic. So this studies conducted in 3 phases. At first, we kind of did a telephone survey of teachers and head teachers, how they were using spaces at home and potentially in the neighborhood to teach, and then an ethnographic observation of 15 families and case study of promising practices to understand the kind of how teachers innovated practices that has helped kind of continuing education during the pandemic. And following that, we also had a phase 2 where we did school case studies and we workshops with teachers and pupils assessing their digital classroom and outdoor infrastructure. The report is available in English and also in Bangla, free to download, and it shows the kind of different approaches to teaching, remote teaching on part of teachers, but also the impact of the pandemic on children and families, which kind of come up with recommendations for policymakers in the 4 areas of interactive online learning, and teachers and learner skills, well-being, and voices of teachers, children, and parents, but more importantly, of kind of inclusive infrastructure that appropriate inclusive environments for both digital and outdoor spaces should be created. And that kind of led us to think of not only school spaces, that we need to map the spaces of schools, school building, outdoor and digital infrastructure, children's home learning spaces, and also learning spaces in their neighborhood. And which led us to kind of, as a follow-on of this project, we are now working with, so myself and my colleague, Dr. Tom Smith from the same school, we are working with Bangladesh government's A2Y program, where I was placed for 2 months this summer, to develop a learning environment toolkit, which can be used by teachers working with children in the schools, kind of to assess their learning environments, what kind of resources are available to them, and how the spaces can be developed. So what we so the toolkit is now being co-created with teachers. So we have done workshops with primary school teachers and secondary school teachers, and we are now working on a kind of toolkit that can be rolled out to all the primary and secondary schools in Bangladesh, who can use this to work with children to assess the environments, and that can perhaps help them make decisions on how they can change their physical environment, alter it with minimal intervention, or where a substantial investment may be needed. And so we are also, I think we're also now, we're organizing a conference on 16th of February 2023 on geographies of blended learning, digital outdoor and blended approaches to learning. So we are exploring the applicability of similar tools in the UK context. The conference will be happening in Glamorgan building, where I'm based, and this is a really beautiful building. So what I wanted to say is that you are welcome to submit your contribution to this conference. Unfortunately, this will only be in person, and the kind of deadline of submission of abstract is in a week. So if you're interested, there is still time. I think to kind of, I'd like to kind of, in a sense, end here, saying, just to say that what I perhaps haven't stressed much on is the kind of voices of children and young people, but what you can see perhaps has been a thread going throughout the presentation, that in all of these discussion, children and young people's voices are particularly not listened to, perhaps in the context of South Asia in terms of their contribution to the design of the spaces. And this is the key to kind of understand how to develop and how the places for pedagogy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. That was a really, really engaging presentation. And thank you for all the sort of sketches and images that you included, really made the research come alive. And it's an absolutely fascinating field of research. I'm so glad we could have you present today. Thank you all of you for being here. There are some questions on the chat, so I'm going to address them now. There's a question from Camilla Hadi Chaudhary, who's now, I think, who isn't online anymore, but I'll read out her question anyway. She says, did this impact other co-curricular activities, like you mentioned, sports? Is there a compromise element in reinventing school spaces?
Yeah, well, what I haven't presented here is the impact on the other activities in the school grounds, which I also observed. So the findings indicated that children were involved in all different sorts of activities, diverse physical, social, and cognitive activities in the school grounds following the intervention. Whereas previously, there are not many girls doing any kind of activities in the school ground, occupied mostly by boys who would play football. But then after the intervention, a large number of both boys and girls are playing in different settings. And one thing that was quite interesting is that the girls are really creative in terms of inventing new games using the settings that we have developed together. And boys started taking an interest on what the girls doing, and they started playing together, which was not something that happened before. So this was the redesigned school ground offered opportunities, diverse opportunities for boys and girls to kind of during their break times. I think that also has an impact to a certain extent to the comparison group we looked into, who didn't have access to kind of the teaching and learning sessions, but had the opportunity to play out there. And
thank you. The next question is from Pamela Woolner. Interesting that there seemed to be more impact on maths than on science outcomes. How does this difference relate to the design?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Pam, because to a certain extent, I think it was not possible to kind of, to a certain extent, disentangle that why the impact on maths is significant. And some of this I would actually probably and that kind of what we perhaps didn't assess here is the teachers' creativity or teachers' agency. What we try to control is that the same teachers are marking the scores, so it is not possible to kind of distinguish the difference between maths and science. So what we could see, the difference is the kind of science across the three groups and maths across the three groups, rather than between maths and science, because then the teacher who is teaching is it was difficult to kind of control that factor within it. So and my one other thing was interesting that teachers were mentioning is that it was also a new environment for teachers, and that when there's always this argument of whether this is the novelty effect, but for teachers, I think novelty effect was in a sense different because the environment was new. It took time for them to think around approaches to teach and learn, approaches to different teaching and learning activities in the school grounds. And what they're mentioning, that with time, they'll be able to be more kind of creative in terms of designing their teaching and learning activities. So yeah, so whereas the kind of sometimes novelty effect in a sense plummet children's activities outdoors during playtimes, for teachers, they think that it can get better with time. That was the perspective of the teachers in interviews.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. I think Pamela is here as well. Pamela, would you like to respond or have any follow-up questions? Please feel free to interact.
Thank you. No, I just thought it just jumped out at me that it was interesting, and that does make sense that perhaps the most obvious things you could think of doing as a teacher perhaps are maths, because it's the more basic subject than science. It's just, I just genuinely thought, oh, that is interesting, because you can often, teachers talk about using the outdoors for science, certainly in the UK context, more than they do for maths. I mean, that was what I think, that's where I was sort of starting from, was that just surprised me. But I think your point about what the teachers then begin to do with the space is, and that can be a number of things, and that can go quite a long way away from what you originally designed in, and that is really interesting. We had a project where there was a gardening project, and this was gardening for growing vegetables and things. So the focus was just on gardening and growing things, and yet in one of the schools, the teacher who was in charge of language learning had labelled all the vegetables in French. And just so that was, I mean, nobody would have thought of that use of the space, of the garden space, but she did. And was one of those examples of you give people an interesting space, and then they run with it in all sorts of directions. So maybe that was what was going on there. But yeah.
Yeah, from my observation of the activities, definitely. So initially, like if I think of my perception, I would have thought science is the most obvious, and it would be better for science. And then I have found like how the maths teacher has been really creative, and I learned a lot just by seeing how she used the space to kind of to reduce the teacher-student ratio, sending students to different behavior settings. So if I am to kind of comment, I think how the teachers have used the space have made a great deal of difference in terms of the maths attainment. But yeah, of course, I didn't measure it, so I kind of like, yeah. So what I can say is from personal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Dr. Khan. There's another question from Sheikh Farid. Would you like to ask your question on your own, if you're here?
Hello, thank you so much. Anyway, because somewhere in her presentation, speaker mentioned about in Bangladesh, there is also in private school, there are some changes in the settings, particularly classroom or space on environment. But compared to public schools, particularly in urban areas, there are no major changes. But what factors actually contribute to the not changes to the public school? Because the government also takes some fund from the UNESCO or what should I call, UNICEF or something like this, because some agencies. So why there is no changes in school? Because there is so much changes over the years in the school settings, but in terms of public school, there is no changes. Because from my childhood, I saw there is no major changes in the school's environment or spaces or classroom settings. So that was my question, actually. Thank you so much, Mohini.
Thank you for your question. Dr. Khan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it brings me to the kind of the initial background that I've given, that understanding the importance of the role of the physical environment. And sometimes, as I said, the investments were mostly made on teachers' capacity development and kind of also introducing kind of stipends for to address children's poverty, but that aspect of the role of place in pedagogies is something that hasn't been looked into with enough. I guess that's I think that's something also that not only the case in perhaps Bangladesh, across the world, that the research of kind of learning environments has not been a very kind of also around kind of theories and empirical studies around how learning environments actually impact academic attainment. So when I first, after my, I think, master research, when I first went to went to the Directorate of Primary Education, I was asked that kind of, okay, please show us how like if you can prove it to us that how the change in learning environments actually improve children's academic attainment, then we may need to think around, okay, how the kind of investment, how we would invest on this. But I think this also investment depends on large number of factors in terms of how the policies within the country are also governed by the international policies and international agendas around development of spaces. So there are PDP, I think it's like PDP 4 is currently going on, and then PDP 5 will come next. And PDP 4 has very kind of stringent, to a certain extent, I'd say, the layout is, to a certain extent, the investments are on kind of adding more classrooms to it, or removing one building to kind of build a new one. But rather than thinking, okay, where we are building new buildings, how should we build that? So of course there are kind of major financial implications where the investment is actually, the decision around it is made by I would say the different bodies in different ways. So it's something perhaps I cannot answer with my hat as a researcher, but this is something I'm also working with the kind of policymakers, just to kind of knocking their doors. As I said, I was in a placement, so I'm running workshops. I'm telling the policymakers, I'm trying to inform them based on my research findings that design of learning environments is important, and I'm developing now this learning environment toolkit to a certain extent push on that. So I guess that's where I stand. But anybody else?
No, anyway, because my understanding is that bureaucracy is so strong in Bangladesh, particularly. They don't consider research. They don't want to consider research finding or implication. They don't want to consider the findings from the research and want to implement that research into action. So bureaucracy, they want to, whatever they think is suitable or good for the nations or for the education system, they want to implement that. So they don't want to consider the findings from research, such as from your finding or someone else, or even that's my understanding. Maybe I am wrong, but I don't know. Sometimes it happens because in Bangladesh, bureaucracy is so strong. So they hear from policymakers, but they don't want to implement that policy into actions. That's my understanding. Anyway, thank you so much.
I think it's also in terms of when we talk about school buildings and design of school buildings, we always think of it incurs a huge sum of money. I think that's when we start to think around, we start to kind of, to a certain extent, the conversation is being turned to other not physical interventions that could do the things. So always interventions in physical environments are being perceived as a kind of major investment, although perhaps millions are being spent on some other non-physical interventions. I think that's to a certain extent, as I'd say, like Pam, you may have some kind of views in the other context as well, where in terms of like why perhaps the kind of changing in environments is not being considered as a priority when we think of educational environment.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sheikh, for your question, and thank you, Dr. Khan, for your detailed responses. Do we have any other questions? We still have about 5-7 minutes. We can wrap up after some final questions. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question?
I suppose I could just join into the discussion, and I was as we were listening to a very wonderful presentation and also looking at these really interesting photographs. I was wondering if there were any surprises in terms of what students, children suggested as learning materials that we may not have seen as, potentially a learning material for the classrooms for various subjects that you're talking about. If you saw some kind of, like, if you found any surprises as you were working with students, and if they suggested something that was interesting and something that was not otherwise seen as potentially educational.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think I will have to know, like, whether I kind of disaggregate that in that sense. I think, to me, just when I was asking them, like, what do you think? Do you think teaching and learning happens outdoors, or what can be there? So I guess even when they're thinking, like, when they're saying, like, there are numbers everywhere, we can learn numbers, like, by just adding elements, like we can count kind of sticks or something, like those were certain things that has kind of then influence the decision of using repetitive elements of so it is not kind of I don't, yeah, perhaps something that I can go back to my data just to kind of disaggregate, but I haven't really in that sense disaggregate, like isolated in terms of what they're saying was surprising, more as a kind of as an in general idea. But also what was interesting is in terms of kind of negotiation of where things should be, like they wanted gardens, and children were aware that gardens can be a kind of really kind of learning environment in terms of what they learn about fruits and vegetables and different flowers and all these things, and the negotiation of where they should place the garden with the teachers. Those negotiations were interesting, kind of how also kind of adult agendas can kind of change in terms of where do you place things, but also negotiating with the designers themselves. Yeah, perhaps it to a certain extent, because before going to the field, I've done extensive background research on how outdoor learning environments can be designed, what kind of so in a sense, I would not think to a certain extent that perhaps the results were quite surprising in that sense. But what was interesting is more of my perception of what perhaps teachers in Bangladesh should value. Then compared to, so I was thinking there would be differences in terms of what teachers in Scotland. So I was based in Scotland. I was visiting schools in Scotland and observing children, the forest school there. But what was interesting is that there was not a lot of difference in terms of how teachers were thinking, how things could be used. There are, of course, difference in terms of how we could design them, particularly because of the weather and context. But in terms of how they can help, the process can help in pedagogy, that's something was not really hugely different. But these children's background made a huge difference, because they come from peasant families, like, so they know about growing things very well, right? How much water you should, like watering the plants to the kind of that certain amount, and then that the pollination that is happening in their surroundings. What I found interesting is actually when underprivileged, or to a certain extent more kind of the children who underachievers in a sense, in the popular sense, that who were not very active in the classroom, were not participating in the discussion, they were participating outdoors because the textbooks were not speaking to them in their language. But then the outdoors is a kind of has this universal language of them kind of finding pollination in their kind of saying, like, okay, how this like I was just trying to think, I was translating it from Bangladeshi English in my yeah. So that's the thing, that how they started to speak in their own language as they were seeing these things being alive in the outdoor environment. Sorry, that is a long kind of extended answer to your question, perhaps. I don't know.
Thank you so much. No, that was really interesting. I don't think we have more questions, but I would like to ask something, and then maybe we can end with that. I was just wondering, also I was thinking of my own fieldwork and things like, which is with primary schools. And I was wondering what kind of sort of ethical considerations you had to look into while doing your research with young children? Because that's something that comes up a lot. And I was just wondering how, what kind of things you had to be concerned about, what things you had to be careful about. How did you actually go about sort of, seeking consent, or how did that work for you? Just curious about that.
Very another kind of very important question. That's something kind of I did work on a kind of ethical consideration in this research. It once made a kind of poster. So the one thing is, because I've been in that school for kind of 7 months, and before even kind of gaining consent, I started kind of building this partnership with the school was important. So knowing the schools and children, the community, all these activities around, so we held kind of community meetings where parents were invited, and other meetings, parents were invited, and we kind of discussed, okay, we want to do these things. What are your views? So we did this before we start kind of, before I approached them for the kind of consent. I think at that point, still the kind of opt-out was applicable, like GDPR didn't come in at that point. So the school could, in that sense, could opt out. But then again, the whole community was involved. So it is much more complex than we're kind of perhaps thinking now. But then, so we kind of gained consent from the parents in that manner. But as I said, the building the partnership was the main thing. But what I was also looking into is perhaps other aspects of ethics, that children's voices, when I'm capturing that I have a responsibility in terms of so giving them, so just listening to them wasn't enough, that actioning on those voices was, I think, is an ethical concern in many ways when we are engaging children and young people in the process, which at a certain extent, you think it kind of, shifts from there, and all these discussions around, okay, how we can kind of action on that. I think those are certain things, and then going back to them with the results and capturing them. So this has happened, like, I think ethics is this continuous journey of when we kind of start, so capturing the voices, but going back to them with the results and having their thoughts on that. These are kind of important steps in there.
Thank you so much. Just in time, we can now wrap up the session. Thank you so much, everyone who's here. I think, most people were here, but had to leave just sort of before we ended the question answer round. But this was a really, really engaging discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for sparing your time and sharing your work with us. I hope that we'll continue to sort of have these conversations and form future collaborations as well. But it's really, really great to know more about your work. And thank you so much for taking your time. And thank you all of you for attending the seminar. We will have monthly seminars running again from next term, from end January. So do watch out, do watch our page on social media at South Asia. And we also have a mailing list. I've put in the link to join our mailing list. So do join it, and we'll keep sharing details about our next sessions. Hopefully we'll come back to this topic in a later seminar as well. So thank you once again. Thank you so much. And see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this.
Thank you.
Look forward to more seminars on perhaps the kind of role of place, kind of discussion and debate.
Definitely.